Our witnesses today include Mr. Peter Levine, who I understand used to work for this committee, so he should know where we are. He will be here soon. A senior fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis, Mr. Moshe Schwartz, senior fellow for acquisition policy at the National Defense Industrial Association, and Dr. William Greenwald, non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. As chair of this subcommittee, one area of focus is ensuring that our service members get the equipment they need to defend our nation. That means delivering weapon systems, supporting technologies, and necessary services in a timely manner to ensure our warfighters have the best possible capabilities. It also means ensuring acquisitions remain on time and on budget, to steward our taxpayer dollars. Since the 2016 National Defense Authorization Act, Congress has enacted nearly 500, repeating, 500 acquisition provisions to provide flexibility and options to the department to tailor acquisition pathways to best fit the types of systems being acquired. DOD's 6 acquisition pathways: urgent capability, middle tier, major capability, software, defense business systems, and services. These are all acquisition pathways. Together, these pathways comprise the adaptive acquisition framework. A recent reform included adding the middle tier of acquisition pathway, I mentioned that, in the 2016 NDAA to more rapidly prototype and field major defense weapons systems. This important change is already bearing fruit in some cases. For example, the Space Force is currently using middle-tier acquisition to quickly procure and launch low Earth orbit satellites on time and on budget. However, the Defense Department's acquisition process still remains on the Government Accountability Office's of high-risk list, which includes programs and operations that are vulnerable to fraud, waste, abuse, mismanagement, or in need of transformation. The GAO recently found that DOD has taken steps to increase its capacity for addressing risks relating to weapons systems acquisition, but at the same time, it also found the department has yet to fully determine key programs oversight aspects for the adaptive acquisition framework. Those are the 6 pathways I talked about. Moreover, in February of 2023, the GAO reported that some DOD components had yet to establish key processes for the middle tier of acquisition pathway. As we can see from these examples, while the department is making incremental progress, there are still improvements to be made. This committee, or the SAS committee, has also spent years creating tools to help the department attract and retain a skilled acquisition workforce. For example, in 2023, we established the Defense Civilian Training Corps to create new opportunity for college students with an interest in vital DOD acquisition-related occupations to receive scholarships in exchange for a service commitment once they graduate. Though this program is in a very early stage, it holds a lot of promise for attracting new talent into the DOD acquisition workforce. The acquisition workforce, the men and women of the Defense Acquisition Corps, is essential to getting the most out of the acquisition system and ensuring that we provide our service members with the equipment they need while also being good stewards of taxpayer dollars. We cannot solve our acquisition problems without an acquisition workforce empowered to make full use of the authorities Congress has provided the department and the judgment to know when to take calculated, smart risks. I want to emphasize that part about risk-taking because the acquisition is not about just zero risk. It is about getting us to the point where we are taking calculated, smart risks, and those risk-taking decisions must be supported up the chain of command so that we can have acquisition practices that truly do give us the most effective ways of acquiring the assets that we need. So, in my view, this requires a culture where acquisition professionals know they have the trust and support of senior leaders, and we must make sure that we retain this specialized workforce once they have the skills and certifications that make them so highly sought after by industry as well as government. So my understanding is what happens is that just as our acquisition workforce is getting the kind of experience they need to be able to fully utilize all the acquisition tools that we provide for them, they are wooed away to the private sector. So there is a dip in our acquisition workforce, and that is not what we need to see happen. So I would like our witnesses to think about how we can retain a skilled workforce, acquisition workforce. So in Hawaii, we know firsthand the importance of a skilled acquisition workforce to the success of our armed forces. For example, Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard relies on a skilled STEM and technician workforce for positions from engineering to welding, but also on contracting officers and management specialists to ensure work is conducted on time and on budget. This is particularly true right now in the building of Dry Dock 5 in Pearl Harbor, which is the largest military construction project in the Defense Department. And unfortunately, the price tag for the dry dock recently incurred a large cost overrun, highlighting the importance of ensuring robust oversight of how the department acquires goods and services and takes care of taxpayer dollars. I thank the witnesses for your willingness to share your insights with the subcommittee, and collectively, you all bring many decades of experience working with and reforming the defense acquisition system. And that experience is critical as we consider ways our committee can help ensure the defense acquisition system is ultimately servicing its intended purposes, delivering the capabilities our service members need in a timely manner. And while we often focus on what's broken with our defense acquisition system, I hope you will share with us your perspectives on what has been working, as well as pointing to the areas where improvements are needed. Thank you again for your expertise and your willingness to spend some time with us. I look forward to your testimony. And I do note that we're going to be in the midst of voting, so the ranking member and I will be taking turns going and voting, coming back. And now I would like to recognize Ranking Member Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair Hirono, and thank you for calling this hearing. It's an issue where there's strong bipartisan support to make some bold reforms. Historian Irving Holley recognized in 1964 that, quote, the procurement process itself is a weapon of war, no less significant than the guns, airplanes, and rockets turned out by the arsenal of democracy in the United States. Unfortunately, right now, this is a weapon that's actually starting to be used against us. And I think in many ways, the purpose of this hearing is to start to turn that challenge around. Unfortunately, it was in the 1960s when the historian, Dr. Holley, mentioned this idea of how important the procurement process is to our national defense, that the Pentagon started adopting the bureaucratic rules and regulations that have come to define our acquisition process today. And it is not surprising that the rapid pace of defense innovation in World War II and the 2 decades after World War II has begun to slow down dramatically. Many of the more recent technologies had to be forced upon our acquisition process, such as unmanned systems, night vision, and proliferated satellites. While there has been no shortage of acquisition reform, as the chair stated, progress remains slow and inadequate. Officials in the Pentagon have not maximized the use of the substantial authorities already provided by Congress. For example, the middle tier of acquisition pathway was intended by Congress to simplify the process, empower program managers, and deliver capabilities within 2 to 5 years. By contrast, traditional programs take on average 11 years to reach initial operational capability. Unfortunately, many legacy programs are working their way back in and slowing down the pace. This seems par for the course with the Pentagon. Back in the 1990s, Congress created commercial item procedures so that the Pentagon could access companies that would otherwise not take on defense business. Since then, more than 165 unnecessary clauses have been added from the onerous federal acquisition regulation. The same problem is apparent with other transactions which were intended to ease the adoption of cutting-edge technologies. So today, for this hearing, it's an opportunity for our witnesses to diagnose why past efforts have failed and prescribe solutions to fully use existing authorities. While it may be a tall order to change the culture of the nearly 200,000 acquisition professionals on how they do their job, we must focus on our efforts on capabilities that can have the greatest impact within the next few years, including unmanned systems, munitions, and very importantly, software and software upgrades. At the same time, we in Congress have a role to play ourselves. We are certainly not without fault in these challenges. In some cases, burdensome approvals, documentation, and reporting requirements have been added to flexible authorities, in essence, wiping them out. I would appreciate if our witnesses could identify specific statutes that you believe constrain the Pentagon or additional authorities that could be useful. Moreover, acquisition reform can go on so far without improving flexibilities in the funding process. Earlier this morning, the full Armed Services Committee held a hearing on the Commission on Planning, Programming, Budgeting, and Execution Reform. I would be appreciative if our witnesses made connections between those reforms that were highlighted in the full hearing today and the acquisition process, especially what we term the Valley of Death. Now, I know many of you are familiar with this. Here is what's happening. We have this great opportunity right now. 10 years ago, the vast majority of Silicon Valley and our tech communities were not interested in working with the Pentagon. You had the ridiculous situation, in my view, where Google employees said, hey, we're not going to do any work for the Pentagon. Okay, we're a free country, that's fine. But then we started to realize they were doing work with the Chinese Communist Party. That's not acceptable to anybody in this Senate. So what we have now is a change of culture in Silicon Valley and other tech communities where they want to work with the Pentagon. And you have funders who want to fund companies that can work with the Pentagon. This is a giant comparative advantage we have over our adversaries, like China and Russia, our innovative tech companies. But here's the problem. They're privately funded. Their funding doesn't last 3 to 4 to 5 years. It might last 6 months. And the Pentagon has been too slow to take up the opportunity to work with them, telling a high-tech company with a great product, we'll put you in our budget in 3 years. Well, they're going to be bankrupt in 6 months. That's the valley of death that is squandering opportunities, and it's a big focus of mine, and I would like to hear from the witnesses how we can address that. So I'd like to conclude, Madam Chair, with just by saying all the buzzwords on innovation and dual-use technologies are not translating into action. Here is a sad fact. It is taking a longer time for the Pentagon to award contracts, while at the same time the number of companies in the defense industrial base is shrinking. We have to reverse that. And we need big, bold ideas from all of you, whether to change the culture of the Pentagon or get Congress to get its act together to finally fix what we all recognize is a huge strategic challenge that hurts our ability to protect this nation. Thank you again to our witnesses and the chair for this hearing. I think it's really important. And again, there is enormous bipartisan support to fix this. Witnessed here by these two senators. We just need the good, big ideas in which to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. And we will start with Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you, Chairwoman Hirono, Ranking Member Sullivan, for inviting me to talk today about the defense acquisition system. Our defense acquisition system, as you both mentioned, takes too long to deliver capability, costs more than it should, and often fails to adopt the most advanced capabilities industry has to offer. In addition, our defense industrial base, as you mentioned, is shrinking. This is a serious problem. In this testimony, I would like to make 5 points. First, workforce is the key to successful acquisitions. Better acquisition cannot be achieved through multiple audits, more regulation, or legislative fiat. Rather, giving a few capable people the authority to do their job, putting them in positions to succeed, with that holding them accountable and minimizing red tape, this is the recipe for better acquisitions. But that is not what we do. Instead, we measure them on compliance and process. In 2021, there was a GAO report that found that of the 6 agencies they reviewed, including the Department of Defense, all relied, and I quote, primarily on process-oriented metrics when managing their procurement organizations. In other words, compliance and process were more important than performance. If we empower the workforce and focus on outcomes, not metrics, we can hold people accountable. We should streamline the approval process. There are statutes that focus on supply chains that are all written just a little differently without any policy reason for doing so. Often, the official with the authority to provide waivers is so senior that the approval process is more time-consuming than it needs to be. Such convoluted requirements adds bureaucracy, it increases costs, it delays delivery, and adds confusion as to who really makes what decisions. As one program executive officer once said to me when expressing his frustration over the approval process, "I was hired to make decisions. If you don't like my decisions, fire me, but let me do my job." This brings me to the second point. We need to streamline the acquisition rules and regulations. There are just too many acquisition rules, and they are too complicated. Done right, streamlining will increase accountability by clarifying lines of authority, shorten timelines, and improve outcomes without undermining oversight. This is the approach industry takes. Fewer regulations, more consistently applied by an empowered workforce. We should encourage using commercial buying processes and look at dollar thresholds that trigger regulations to ensure that the cost and delay of imposing requirements do not outweigh the potential savings these requirements could generate. We should take a holistic approach to oversight, ensuring that regulations aimed at solving specific problems don't have unintended consequences to the overall acquisition system that causes more harm than good. This brings me to my third point. DOD needs to modernize its IT systems and improve how it uses data to make decisions. Data analytics can improve all aspects of procurement, but DOD's IT and business systems are hampering its ability to leverage data. First, DOD is using outdated systems and plans to spend more than $275 million over the next 4 years on systems that the DOD Comptroller's Office stated, quote, can and should be retired. And that is only the financial systems. Second, DOD faces cultural and bureaucratic challenges in adopting modern IT systems, as exhibited in the stalled effort to replace the defense travel system with a modern and proven commercial IT solution that is used today by thousands of companies. DOD is working to improve its data architecture. Just a few weeks ago, DLA awarded a contract to adopt commercial supply chain and business capabilities. Such efforts can dramatically improve acquisitions. This brings me to my fourth point. Operations and maintenance matter. Sometimes our focus on the procurement of a weapon system and on driving down early procurement costs has negative long-term effects. 70% of the life cycle cost of systems is operation and maintenance, yet we are not investing sufficiently in that area. This trend is hurting readiness. It is cheaper to maintain systems that we already have than to buy more systems to make up for readiness gaps that are a result of insufficient O&M. Finally, my last point, we can be smarter in helping small businesses. Despite meeting all its small business targets, the number of small businesses working with DOD has declined over the last 12 years. The targets and set-asides too often are an end in themselves rather than a catalyst for expanding small business participation in the defense industrial base or identifying capabilities that we need. DOD and Congress can take other approaches to expand small business participation. For example, small businesses generally do not have the resources to build or maintain secure compartment information facilities, or SCIFs, creating a barrier to entry for small businesses, allowing businesses to access underutilized SCIF space, or establishing new SCIFs, for example, in excess GSA facilities, could help small and other businesses increase competition and provide new capabilities to the department. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Levine?
Thank you, Chairman Hirono. Thank you, Ranking Member Sullivan. Senator Kane, good to see you again. I'd like to just first thank you for not just for inviting me here today, but for the leadership that you're showing on this issue. This is a tremendously important issue, and it's really good to see senators like you committed to making the acquisition system better. Rather than repeating my opening statement, what I thought I would do is to respond to a few of the really good points that you guys made, senators, sorry, that you made in your opening statements. So first, Senator Hirono, you mentioned the acquisition workforce, and I agree that that's completely key. And you talked about how we lose some of our best acquisition people when they're in their prime years. I would urge you to think, one area to think about in that regard is think about military rather than civilian, because the real brain drain that we have in the acquisition system is on the military side rather than the civilian side, and it's because of career patterns where we push people out because of up or out when they're still in their prime. And I know this committee has thought in the past about career tracks that would be different for some military, but the acquisition field is one area where we probably need to think about that. We train these guys up, they're really, really good, and then we push them out because they're not going to make general officer or flag officer. Second, Senator, you mentioned risk, and I agree with you. It's important to take risk, and I really appreciate the fact, Chairman Hirono, that you mentioned smart risk. Because it is important as we take risks that we understand where we should take them and where we shouldn't take them. And what I would say is it's important to fail early. It's important to take risks early also. So you want to take your risks when you have less money at stake, less quantities at stake. You don't want to take big risks when you have a $1 billion program and millions of items, and if you fail, you're going to be failing with billions of dollars rather than hundreds of millions or tens of millions. You want to figure those things out early. Turning to Senator Sullivan, I really appreciated what you said about some of the tools that are being underutilized, and you particularly mentioned there the middle tier acquisition. And I would agree that I think there are some ways in which that has been underutilized. But I would urge you to think about it this way. Not everything can be bought with middle tier acquisition authority. For example, we're never going to think about building an aircraft carrier with middle tier because you can't build an aircraft carrier in 5 years. I think we know that. A new next generation bomber isn't going to be built with middle tier because it's not going to be done in 5 years. What I would urge you to think about is, and to push the department on, is what that authority really tells the department is think differently about what you're going to buy, not just how you're going to buy it, but what you're going to buy. Think about things that are closer to being ready for acquisition, more incremental, and you'll be able to buy them faster and field them faster, field them more incrementally and continuous and engage in continuous improvement. It's these huge projects where we put all of our eggs in one basket that is going to take 20 years. It can't be done with middle tier, so you have to think about breaking it down differently and buying different things. It's not just a matter of using different procedures. It's a matter of are we going to keep buying the same things in the same way. Second, you mentioned the PPBE Commission. I sat on that commission as well. I would be happy as we get into the Q&A to talk to you about what we found and our conclusions regarding the Valley of Death and some things that Congress can do there. The last thing that I would like to leave you with is Yes, the acquisition system is overly bureaucratic. It has too many regulations. I have some suggestions in my written testimony of some areas where you could take action on it. But to give credit to the people who are in the department, I think we need to remember that what they're trying to do is really, really hard. It's really hard to build something from scratch, to design it from the ground up. It's also really hard even to buy a commercial technology. Commercial off-the-shelf should be easier than it is, where we're buying something that already exists. But most of the time when we're buying commercial, we're not buying off-the-shelf. We're buying a technology that will cost as much time and as much money to adapt for military use as it took to develop in the first place. If you look at the Army's experience with battlefield radios and communications with jitters and WIN-T, you can see systems that took decades. That's not because they're technologies that haven't been used in the commercial sector. It's because putting those into a military situation and adopting them to be hardened and ready for use and in all the circumstances where we need it in a contested environment requires adapting them, and once you start changing them, it becomes extremely expensive and time-consuming. It's hard to do. So all the points that you make are really valid, but this is a hard problem to crack. It's not something where there are going to be any easy answers. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greenwald.
Thank you, Chairman Hirono and Senator Sullivan, Senator Kane, other distinguished members of the committee, subcommittee. I think I'm going to do the same thing. I've entered a statement for the record, and I'll just kind of summarize and try to take on some of these points. The first thing is, yes, we do have a system today, an acquisition system that's optimized for peacetime. And I think we have to understand that. A lot of conflicting different executive orders, regulation, law that drive behavior in the acquisition system. So for 30 years, we've been optimizing this system, and it's frankly now too slow to do what is necessary. This committee, this subcommittee, about 10 years ago, essentially looked at that and said, we need to go faster, and created a toolkit, including middle tier, including production and other transactions, including ways of hiring acquisition workforce faster. And it was adopted and tried to replicate a system of innovation that the Department of Defense used to have in the post-World War II era, in the 1950s, and it was driven by time. It was driven by urgency. It was driven by step-by-step serial operational prototyping. In other words, middle tier type of acquisition was a way of trying to replicate that system. And guess what? What did we do in the 50s? We deployed aircraft carriers, new aircraft classes in less than 5 years, bombers in less than 5 years, ICBMs, first of a kind, in less than 5 years, first reconnaissance satellites in less than 5 years. We did these type of new innovations. Now, would they be like the type of system that we've created in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s? No, because there were different criteria we've added to ensure certain types of process and certain types of systems that are producible or maintainable or whatever. But innovation was driven in that time through a time-based competitive process of serial operational prototypes. And this committee, with middle tier, just tried to replicate that. The second most important part was, at that time, the industrial base was brought together. The commercial and the defense industrial base was working together. And the barriers that exist today between Silicon Valley working with the defense or other commercial companies didn't exist then and is so much higher today. So other transactions are one of the ways to do that, because you can negotiate a commercial terms and condition, commercial way of doing business with those companies. And the idea is to bring them forward. Probably the biggest barrier today, and I'm glad Peter's here from the PPP Commission, is budgeting. In other words, the valley of death problem is a budget issue-driven problem. Venture capital needs revenue. And each time you move forward in the acquisition process, there's kind of a waiting period. And any of those waiting periods is there's a need for flexible funds to carry it through to the next stage. And wherever the PPB Commission has proposed those type of flexible funding, that's something I think for this committee to seriously consider, because it really could do a lot of good things. I proposed a pilot in my testimony in which Congress could potentially consider as a way of empowering agencies like DIU or SOCOM or wherever to essentially pull together these acquisition authorities and streamline the ability for them to use that. I think the Replicator Initiative is a really positive initiative. We can get there. You've got to put an organization in charge of these things. You need to ensure that they've got the right acquisition workforce. That requires hiring authority, and that requires various authorities to be able to use there. You have to empower them to use other transactions, empower them to use rapid acquisition authority, empower them to use middle tier authority, and finally give them the types of flexible budget flexibility that can carry these programs into the next phase. With that, I think I'm looking forward to your questions, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some answers.
Great. Well, the chair went to go vote, so I'm going to take over here. Let me begin. Mr. Schwartz, did you bring a copy of the FAR?
Among other things, yes.
Can I see it? Can I see it? Or is it too heavy to lift?
I will lift it, but in comparison, this is the complete works of William Shakespeare. Right? So you also have the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, and the PGI for the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. Now, if you work for one of the services, there's more guidance and regulations, but I apologize, I ran out of paper this morning to get that. So it would be a little bit higher. This is what we have to do for acquisition. Now, when I was in grade school, it was hard enough for me to read William Shakespeare. This is a difficulty, and I think one of the things that this does is we're talking about empower the workforce. It freezes the workforce.
Yeah.
And I just want to tell one story about it, if I may. I remember after Hurricane Katrina and Rita, I went down with the GAO team to visit, and we're talking to a bunch of contracting officers that were working really hard for recovery for people, right, for FEMA. And these people were working 16, 17-hour days.
Yeah.
And at one point they turned to us and said, just tell us what you want. You want small business, we'll get you small business. You want best price, we'll get you best price. You want speed, we'll get you speed. You want best quality, we'll get you best quality. We can't do it all the time. One, he is right, but two, what that concerns me with is the one thing he didn't mention is what's best for the people. He mentioned he's always thinking about what do the regulations tell me to do and what will I be yelled at.
Yeah. So let me ask this real quick. If you're a company with a great innovative idea and you've done a prototype on your own with private investor money, and you're like, all right, now I want to get this to the Pentagon because it's going to help in our upcoming war with China or whatever. Do they have to all of a sudden understand that stack? Or is that for the contracting officers or the combo?
It's both, right? The contracting officers for sure. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. But you need to know if you need a cost accounting system. You need to know if you have to have certain small business plans. You need to know what domestic buying requirements you have. You need to know.
So if you're beginning an innovative American company, which again, in my view, is a giant strategic advantage we have over everybody else, and now they're interested. These great Americans who are really innovative and really smart want to help. They see the challenges in the world. They see that the authoritarian dictatorships are on the march, whether in Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, working together. So they want to help. But then they see that and they're just like, what?
They don't. Many don't. I know a company that has a great technology, someone who worked on the Hill. And I said, this is great. Have you brought this to DOD? He said, I'm not going to. It's just not worth it. We are small. We have a great technology. We have limited resources. I'm not going through that. And it broke my heart.
Yeah. Okay, let me, Let me ask Dr. Greenwald, one thing that I think a lot of people miss. So I like to read a lot of history. I'm reading this really good book that was actually given to me by the CNO a couple of weeks ago called The Admirals, and it's all about the five-star admirals that we had during World War II. And the innovation, and of course that was a entire societal effort, but I think I'm trying to remember, I don't want to get the numbers incorrect, but you know, we cranked out in 1943 or 42 to 43, I think like 17 aircraft carriers or something, and then by 44 it was just, the numbers are incredible. But the innovation was also occurring, as you just mentioned, in the 50s. So we're not like at World War II levels of entire economy focus. We're in peace, with the exception, of course, the Korean War, which is a big exception. But so what happened after that? You just gave some good examples. The other one I always like to cite is the SR-71, which I think I've read, you know, they designed on a slide rule and it came, you know, from concept to prototype in 18 months or something crazy like that. And that spy plane lasted for decades. So what happened? Like what happened between the 50s SR-71 and the F-35 that took, I think, 25 years to field? What happened in your view?
It's a long story, but I'll try to summarize. In the 1960s, we adopted a way of putting a system around all of that innovation. And I even kind of think about, there's the good Rickover and the bad Rickover. And the good Rickover was the one who essentially was of the time-based innovation approach, you know, developed the first nuclear naval reactor. If you remember how many classes of nuclear submarines were created in the 50s to get to the point where we wanted to. Well, we got to the point where we wanted to, and then we decided, well, we're going to manufacture these. And we shifted into a different system. And what we should have done is had two acquisition systems. One for how to be incredibly innovative and drive new technology into the hands of the warfighter, and the other one was how to produce systems at scale.
Right.
But when we started producing systems at scale, Admiral Rickover wanted cost accounting standards. He wanted you know, greater insight into contractor costs. And that's kind of the, I'm not going to say the bad Rickover, that's just the Rickover that transitioned to something that was needed to produce things at scale. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we adopted what were business best practices of the 1950s from the private sector, which actually weren't really good business best practices. And they were based on centralized planning, based on prediction, a very linear ways of thinking. They were brought from Ford Motor Company with McNamara in the 60s. And the DOD adopted these writ large. And we've been working on this system for the last 60 years. But what happened is we didn't quite realize that the same management system didn't work out very well for the private sector. The Japanese essentially, with quality management and other approaches, essentially outcompeted us. And the private sector threw out all this centralized planning. They threw out all of this ways of this bureaucratized linear process. But the Department of Defense never did. And so, you know, we adopted many of those processes. We essentially looked at our adversary, the Soviet Union, and mirrored some of their processes. Yeah. And we created a morass of bureaucracy in the 60s. So the thought is, let's go back to the 50s. Let's go back to how we can produce things better and create two acquisition systems that essentially can complement each other.
Good. Great. Well, listen, a lot more to discuss. When you talk about imitating our adversaries, I've always thought it would make a lot of sense. Hopefully no Chinese communist officials are listening right now, but we mark that giant pile top secret. They've been stealing all our stuff anyways. We dump it in front of the Chinese embassy and hopefully they get it and like, oh, this is amazing, we'll use this. And then we'll destroy their system the way we've kind of destroyed our system, but maybe that wouldn't work. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan, and thanks to colleagues. I want to follow up a little bit on where Dan started. And Peter, I like that you called us you guys because you're so familiar to this committee. I saw you slip there, and I appreciated that. which is entry points for the small innovators. So if the small innovators look at that stacker, as you said, Mr. Schwartz, they're just like, yeah, I have a capacity I can bring, and I'd like to, but I'm not going to do it. Talk about the efficacy of the DIUs and the AFWorks. I think Dr. Greenwald mentioned DIUs. There is the effort to create some entry points that might be more friendly to these small innovators. Are they achieving their value? Is there more we should do to help them achieve their value? Dr. Greenwald, you want to start since you mentioned that in your testimony?
Yeah, no, I think we need to, Congress and the Secretary of Defense need to empower them and give them the tools to do what they're empowered to do. So DIU should be given flexible hiring authorities. They should be given the flexible budgeting authorities. They should be given the ability to move fast and transition these type of systems. I think there is that. It's a real. We have the nucleus of doing the right things. We probably just need more of them, and they need to be empowered to take that there and say, let's use an OTA, which is a one-page agreement, and work with the private sector, and then eventually evolve into something better. Peter,
please, Peter.
So, Senator, yes, I think they're helpful, and they're helpful not just because of a less bureaucratic approach. They're helpful because one of the biggest problems facing that small business is figuring out where in the Department of Defense to go with the product.
Right.
Just looking at 800,000 civilians and 1.2 million or however many military we have and trying to figure out all these different commands, who is it who's going to want my product? So if you have entry points who look like they're friendly to innovative products, that's a really good place to start, not just from the point of view of regulation, but from the point of view of having an entry point. If I could, I'd like to take a couple minutes and speak in favor of regulation, since you don't get to hear that very often. You're too young. I know you're my age, so I guess I can't say that, but you're almost too young to remember back to the beginning of the Clinton administration when Al Gore was doing his reinventing government. But one of the things that they did when they came in was to look at regulation, not just this, which was here at the time, but other regulations. And one of the things that they actually did was on the personnel side, there was something called the Federal Personnel Manual, which was for civilian personnel policy, which was about as thick as this. And they said, we're going to deal with regulation by throwing that out. The Federal Personnel Manual doesn't exist as of today. And the problem is that all the issues that personnel professionals had to deal with were still there. So you had pirated copies of the Federal Personnel Manual that people still had on their shelves, even though they weren't official, because they needed to figure out a framework that they could use to answer those questions. And so my take on these regulations is, when you're buying everything from nuclear aircraft carriers to paper clips, you don't have 2 acquisitions. You don't even have 4 acquisition pathways. You have 15, 20, 50 acquisition systems. And in order to govern 15, 20, or 50 acquisition systems, which are governing different types of decisions and a full range of decisions on everything from technical data rights to negotiating price to small business privileges, whatever it is, it takes a lot of words. And in fact, I have this contrarian view that if you want to give more flexibility, what you actually need is more pages, not less. And the reason is, if you just take away the pages, then people will go into their defensive crouches and do what they've always done because they don't know what they can get away with and what they can't. If you want to encourage them to do something different, you need to tell them, here are your options and here are the things you can be thinking about as you consider those options. Then you're giving them protection to take risks and telling them it's okay to take risks. If you're silent, then you haven't answered any of their questions and they go back to, this is the way I've always done it. So for what it's worth.
If I could, Madam Chair, I'd love to ask another question that might involve an answer pretty deep into my stoppage time, but I'm the chairman of the Sea Power Subcommittee. And so in particular, I'd love any of your thoughts on ship and sub procurement. Like, what do you think about the way the Navy procures ships and subs? And are there big picture pieces of advice you would offer to us as we're getting into the NDA? There's some controversy right out of the gate in the President's budget about, the carrier block buy sliding, the reduction in Virginia class at the same time as we're telling the Aussies we're going to produce Virginia class subs for them. Talk to us about your thoughts about ship and sub procurement.
I think on the ship and sub side, that is where the traditional acquisition system actually works pretty well. And I think our biggest problem in some of our other areas is that we've tried to take the ship and sub acquisition process and apply it in areas where it's not really appropriate. I think what we need here is we have an industrial-based problem. We essentially have a workforce, supply chain, budget a problem, but the way we buy things is pretty time-tested. Now, if you wanted to do new autonomous vehicles, new technology, I would take it in a different way than how we're buying submarines today. And that's why we need multiple pathways and multiple ways of doing things.
Can I put you on the spot, Mr. Schwartz, on this question about the Navy?
Yeah, on the Navy? Absolutely.
Ship and sub?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is the workforce of the contractors is a huge problem. If there's too much of a gap between ships that you're building, you lose the welders. That is not an easy skill, right? And the cost of bringing back the welders and retraining them and losing welders in and of itself has a consequence on budget. So that is one. The second is thinking through how we do CapEx. Right? So I remember, and this was a number of years ago, but going down to a shipyard, and everything was outdoors, right? And now some of that has changed, but I think it's illustrative because in Asia, they had already for years and years and years been doing a lot of this building indoors to the point where the Navy was paying for material that was rusted because it was outdoors. The sick leave for workers because they were doing the welding outdoors was a cost. Sometimes those things in trying to save money really has the larger consequence of not saving money because the perturbation of the workforce, because of not wanting to invest in the facility that has people outdoors. I think those are a couple. And then if I may, I wanted to give you 2 data points on small business and DIU and those because you asked. As the defense industrial base is shrinking, from 2010 to 2020, the number of companies in consortia, which primarily do OTAs, of 12 consortia that work with the federal government, went from 365 to 5,600. It's not that companies don't want to work with DOD. Companies don't want to work with this because the consortia is the entry point and doesn't do some of this. And I'm not saying regulation is bad. I don't disagree with Peter at all on that. It's how we do it. The other point is, of the 12 consortia, their membership was either 56 to 72% small business. So there are entry points. We just need to leverage those more.
Could I ask Mr. Levine, please, Peter, on the Navy ship and sub?
So, Senator, you're taking me down memory lane because if you remember the last year I was here, I believe we had an administration that cut an aircraft carrier, and you and I had to work together to figure out how to pay for that. Which brings me to what I think is really the crux of the issue, which is we're trying to build and maintain a Navy that is bigger than we can fit into the budget that we have. And that's what leads to the problem with the workforce. That's what leads to the problem with gaps in production. We are always looking for ways to build ships differently and less expensively, and we've run into problems with that where we've tried to cut corners and it's come back to hurt us. But if there were one place and I know this isn't going to be new to you, but if one place that we need to continue to look, it's the lack of a commercial industrial base in this area. Because we don't buy build commercial ships in this country anymore, we have a big problem with maintaining an industrial base. And if there were some way that we could rebuild a commercial industrial base, it would be an awful lot easier on us to build military ships.
As I hand it back to the chair, you sound like Mark Kelly, a proud Merchant Marine Academy grad who makes that point often at our hearings. So thanks, Madam Chair.
Having chaired the CPOWER subcommittee before, yes, that is another committee that is always pretty much frustrated. I think that's a good way to explain a lot of the challenges that we face. One thing that did catch my attention, Mr. Schwartz, is when you say the DOD is planning to spend $725 million in the next 4 years on systems, controllers, on systems that are already outdated. But having said that, that sounds outrageous, but isn't it the case also that by the time we figure out what systems would make sense for us to acquire and figure it out and installing it, we're already behind. I mean, we're constantly behind. Maybe the question is how far behind, how far outdated are we going to find acceptable? But what would be what is your answer? You gave that as I would say, as an outrageous example of inefficiencies.
So I would suggest one of the fundamental problems is the challenge the DOD has after they have identified a system with actually implementing business transformation, or can go by a number of names. And the example, I think the ideal example is defense travel system. Right? It's not, in fact, the most popular system in the Department of Defense. I don't know how many people have used it, but it's not, right? A system was identified to replace it with through a successful OTA, one that is used by thousands of companies and hundreds of thousands of people every day, a commercial system. It is used. They tried to adopt it. And then they just gave up and said, we just can't do it. Not because the system doesn't work, because it's too hard culturally for us to get it adopted throughout the Department of Defense. That is a cultural problem, so it's not just, thank you, sorry again. It's not just identifying the system, it's that business process transformation that DOD does not do well.
Is it that it doesn't do well because we don't have the acquisition people, workforce that can make it happen? Is it that we don't have enough experienced people? They leave just when they get the experience that they need to make smart decisions? I mean, what is it that makes them incapable?
So I think there are a lot of reasons, but I know Peter's got some thoughts on this.
Senator,
Mr. Levine.
it's hard. And let me talk about DTS. I was here on Capitol Hill when a couple of attempts to replace DTS failed. I was in the Department of Defense, and I can't remember which position, but with some responsibility for DTS, when the Defense Digital Service came to me and said, we want to replace DTS. And I told them, good luck, you're not going to be able to. And I'll tell you why. Because it's not a technology problem. It's not a problem of adapting a commercial technology. It's not a problem that you have a commercial system that doesn't work. It's not a cultural problem. The problem is, with DTS, we have a set of travel regulations that are almost as big as this set of acquisition regulations. And so our defense travel system has to comply with these regulations. You can take a commercial system with commercial technology that works off the shelf, but when you try to build into it these regulations, the whole thing collapses. And that's what we've been up against over and over again. You can't solve the DTS problem until you solve the defense travel regulations problem. And that's a corner of what you deal with business systems in the Department of Defense generally. We take an off-the-shelf commercial system, an enterprise resource program, for example, an ERP, and we say this is something that business uses to run their business. Why can't we run it? And then you discover that defense looks different and it works differently, and we have different systems we need to plug into, different data, different requirements, and the commercial system can't bear all of that. And so we have a huge problem with adoption of commercial technology because we're different.
So I would actually disagree with some of that on DTS, because DOD's own view of the pilot program was that it was successful, right? And while I totally agree with you, Peter, that the financial rules, which I would have printed out if I had more paper, are a problem, it is also a cultural barrier, because there was a directive that this shall be the system of record, and then the services decided they're not going to implement it. So I think it's both. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it is both.
Mm-hmm. So those reams of paper that you have there, that is to show what?
Oh,
all the requirements?
I apologize. So what we have here is the federal acquisition regulation. Now, if you're in the Department of Defense, you also have to follow the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. Then you have the PGI for the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation, the guidance. There's also, depending on what service you are, more regulations that could be Army or Navy specific, but as I mentioned, I ran out of paper, so I could not print more, so I apologize. And that was just to compare it to the complete works of Shakespeare.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Could I just interject something? In which of those two sets of text is the phrase, "a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury and signifying nothing"? Is that Shakespeare or is that the federal regulations?
I believe it's Shakespeare.
Okay. All right, just checking.
So, okay, what I get is that we have overregulation or all these requirements. And we can reduce some of those requirements and still get what we need in terms of say, for our warfighters' capabilities. So that's one. We have reams and reams of stuff that they have to comply with. But on the other hand, I am also told that, you know, through these pathways that I talked about, 6 pathways, that those pathways were intended to speed up the acquisition process. But that doesn't happen. Those are tools that we've provided to the acquisition workforce, but they are not fully utilized because we do not have a workforce willing to take smart risks. I want to spend a little bit of time, I know I'm over time, but hey, what the heck, I'm the chair. So, and by the way, if you'd like a second round since we're here, please feel free. But really, when we focus on the acquisition workforce, the full committee hearing also focused on a workforce that would be experienced and trained to make use of the tools that are currently available to speed up the processes, including acquisition process. So what can you tell this committee about what to do about a workforce, retaining the kind of a workforce that is willing to take smart risks in acquisitions? Anybody?
So first, I would say that a fair amount of the problem that you identify with using different acquisition pathways is leadership direction rather than the acquisition workforce. So we need to be clear. I think we have a very talented acquisition workforce, and we don't want to run them down too much. We do have a problem with recapitalizing and rebuilding it and retaining and building on expertise. When I was on the committee 15 or so years ago, I think one of the things that we did that was the most important the whole time I was here that I worked on was creating the Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund. The reason I say that is because we neglect our civilian acquisition workforce. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year on military recruiting, on military training. We think about military, we plan for our military strategically. We think about what talent we're bringing in today, not only in terms of filling the job today, but where are they going to be in 10 years and 15 years and 20 years, and how are we going to have the expertise that we need. On the civilian side, we don't recruit, we don't systematically retrain, we don't take advantage of the training. When we send people to training, we bring them back and we put them in jobs that don't relate to the training that they had. We don't plan career paths. We really neglect our civilian workforce. And yes, we can do more there with the resources we have, but it really is an area where we ought to think about more resources, and we ought to think about reinvigorating the Defense Acquisition Workforce Fund or creating something similar, because it is a pervasive problem, the underfunding and the neglect of the workforce. And just to put in perspective, my wife, who was a civil servant, used to come home with computer problems, and my son would look at her and say, I can't believe that they're paying you, however much they're paying you, and you have a problem with a $300 computer and they won't just replace it. That's 2 hours of your time, and the federal government won't do that. It's the same thing with the investment that we put into the civilian workforce in other places, in recruiting and training, in career paths, in building quality and making the workplace an attractive place to work. A small amount of investment would go a really long way there.
Well, I'd like to identify how many people are in the civilian workforce part of the acquisition workforce.
Well, the acquisition workforce is somewhere on the order of 150,000,
Yes.
and it's predominantly civilian.
But if I may, we also don't always put people in positions to succeed. And I'll give you an example. There was I believe it was a lieutenant colonel. Let's go into the uniformed personnel example that Peter was talking about in his statement. He was doing his first stint as a program manager on an IT system for logistics. So I said to him, oh, wow, this is great. It's your first management position, program manager position. That's great. So you must have experience in IT. He said, no, never did IT before. Okay, but you've done logistics. No, never did logistics before. We didn't put him in a position to succeed, and that's a problem.
Can I follow on what Peter said?
Certainly.
Because I think Peter was being way too modest about the Defense Acquisition Workforce Development Fund. That was probably the most significant piece of legislation this committee passed to improve the acquisition workforce. And unfortunately, about 3 or 4 years ago, that fund was abolished and replaced by something else which is not even capable of doing what's necessary. And I think a recommendation that I would make, and I don't know if Peter would make too, is to reestablish that funding mechanism, because that funding mechanism was very unique and clever in the way it took expiring appropriations or took a tax on expiring appropriations and brought that money in to pay for training and new hires and things like that. It worked well for at least 10 years.
Okay, I I know I'm going to need to go and vote soon. I don't know if you do also, but I understand that Senator Sullivan is coming back. I assume he wants a second round. You may want a second round. But in really focusing on what we need to do in acquisition changes, I understand that we need to do better with the civilian workforce. I also understand we need to do better with the military workforce. So if we were to focus just on the workforce, I would very much appreciate some very specific things that we should be doing to empower the workforce to take what I would call smart risks, understanding that smart risk is also in the eyes of the beholder. It may not be that, it's not that easy to define. But I do understand that there are some specific things we can do to train our workforce better, to retain them, and those things. So if you can provide us with some specifics, which I think you did, staff has them, we will follow up with some specific changes that we can do. What to do with the $700 million we're going to spend on an outdated system, I'm not quite sure what we can do on that, but we'll certainly give it a whirl. Did you want a second round of questions?
Oh, I have like 20 more questions, but I'm good. And I voted twice, so I'm ready to cover for the chair if she wants to. Let me, is that over to me, Madam Chair? Okay. I do want to, Mr. Greenwald, I want to, or Dr. Greenwald, I want to just follow up, and this is for all three of you. This idea, and I've heard it a lot, and I think it makes a lot of sense. The idea of maybe a two-track system. And, you have the system that you need. It's kind of a command economy system that you need to build a sub or a aircraft carrier. Okay, we all get that. But, and that has its own processes and everything. But another track that would be much more focused on speed, and although the first track should be focused on speed too. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? And any other witnesses who want to, if you think that's a good idea?
Be happy to. And I think the acquisition pathways that DOD has come forward with actually is trying to do that. So the major capability area pathway is exactly what we were talking about as far as the submarines and the large legacy production of things that we're going to continue to produce as platforms in the next few decades.
And there's no giant market for subs, right? I mean, there's one buyer. I mean, well, maybe a few buyers.
It's a different industrial-based problem. It's a different acquisition problem. Now, yes, efficiencies can be had, but a lot of it is just dealing with the industrial base and addressing throughput in budget and long-term multi-year type procurements would be something that would be helpful there. In the innovation side, that should be a time-based innovation process, and we have two pathways, actually three pathways that could be helpful there. The rapid acquisition pathway, which is the pathway that was created essentially with congressional authority in the early 2000s to deal with post 9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And those were designed to deploy capability of the warfighter in less than 2 years.
Okay, is that working?
It has worked in the past. It seems to be
times.
A few times. The key thing there is it has the ability to start things without a new start authority, and it has flexible funds to move forward on those type of starts. Probably in that area, the most important thing would be is to bring the combatant commanders into the equation more than they are, and potentially even to think about some type of limited acquisition authority for them to drive some of that change, or at least some type of limited demand.
So that's authority you think they have that they're not using?
They don't have that authority.
Oh, they don't have
the command commanders do not have the authority. The SOCOM does, and the Cyber Command has said to
give it to other combatant commanders.
But the geographical commands do not. We had.
Was that a good idea for this year's NDAA, for example?
If you did, you could create authority like we had with JIFCOM. Joint Forces Command was designed to essentially buy on behalf of the geographical commands and drive innovation into the geographical commands.
Should we give that to every combatant commander?
You could do that. They may not be able to handle it, but at least someone you should pilot it and think about the possibility of doing that. The third pathway is middle tier, and middle tier is the 3 to 5. And again, that authority, if you give it to the right organizations and they can drive innovation, we can be seeing that.
But
So
again, didn't we already provide that authority in all those areas?
you have provided that authority, and it's being used probably about 1% of the budget. It's now being used middle tier. I mean, that's where we are.
Any other thoughts on these two questions, gentlemen? Mr. Levine?
So,
Dr. Schwartz?
Senator Sullivan, yes, you're absolutely right. We need at least two pathways, and as Bill has been talking about, we do
maybe
have,
more than two?
We have a lot more than two, and that's a good thing, and we're underutilizing some of them. I think that's all fair. The one that I would point you to is the software acquisition pathway.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot more we need to do in that area. Software is unique. We need to buy it differently. I have
Almost the flip side of a carrier, right? Because the software you're updating every 6 months, right? And you have to.
Maybe every 6 days.
You're updating frequently, and this is an area, particularly you mentioned the PPBE Commission earlier, where there's a recommendation in there that I would point you to, which is as you update software frequently, you're going through development, procurement, testing, debugging, redevelopment, reprocuring, refielding, going around that and around that and around that. If you use the traditional funding system, that means you're changing color of money maybe several times in a year. And to get that right and have the right color of money, I assume color of money is good, and to have the right color of money at the right time in the right place is almost an impossibility. And so what we say is, let's have a different rule for software. If you're buying a software with O&M, go ahead and develop it and test it and field it. If you're buying with procurement, same thing. Go through the entire cycle and just stay in the same color of money, because we know software is different, and you have to be able to go through that and have that flexibility.
Like a private company would.
Absolutely. You're not going to have to go back and ask Congress because I went through a new cycle where I'm debugging something, and now that counts as development, and I need to get a different color of money.
So that's one of your big recommendations?
It's
and we have
it's
not,
a small recommendation.
well, it sounds,
compared to some of the
sounds
others.
pretty substantial to me, but
an
we
important
don't.
one.
That authority doesn't exist right now?
No, it doesn't. There's some.
That would have to be legislated.
It would have to be. It's complicated. So it's in the federal financial regulation, which you would say is just legislative, but in fact it's sort of dictated by the Appropriations Committee. So you risk getting crossways of the appropriators who feel strongly about how their money is spent. And
Yeah, that happens here a lot, as
yes.
you know. Okay, Mr. Schwartz, any other?
Yeah, I'll just add two things. One is, I've seen that problem with the budget and IT systems, and even not IT or software, all the time, and it has a lot of impacts. One is schedule, of course, but the other one is the time it takes to figure these things out. I remember being in a meeting with two programs. One had too much money, one had too little money because of their schedules in the same PEO office, and they couldn't move it, right? And so an hour-and-a-half meeting, probably 45 minutes was spent on how do they deal with these issues, and that has these knock-on effects.
Senator, if I could just add one other thing on software. I worked with the Defense and Innovation Board's software, I can't remember, DIB swap acquisition, whatever their software acquisition process study, whatever they called it. And they had a recommendation for a separate software acquisition pathway, which Congress adapted. There was one piece of their recommendation that Bill and I actually worked on together, which I thought was very important, which Congress did not adopt. And I have it in my testimony, but I think it's worth mentioning here. The issue is that you have some software engineers and developers who are much better and more productive than others. The way our federal acquisition system works, when we run a competition, price has to be a factor. And when price is a factor for something we don't know what we're going to build yet, the way we consider price is by considering rates. So if Company A is going to charge me $300 an hour for an engineer, and Company B is going to charge me $250 an hour for an engineer, that looks less expensive. Of course, the $300 engineer may be 10 times as good, and proving that and justifying going to the high-priced contractor is hard. So what we recommended is that this is an area where we need to learn the lesson that we did 50 years ago, 40 years ago with architect-engineer contracts, where we said, let's do a competition initially in certain circumstances where it's appropriate that's based purely on qualifications and get the best guy in here to do the job, because this is software where the best guy is going to, where it's really critical software, and I want to have the best guy. So I'm going to do a competition based on qualifications, and once I get the best guy in, then I'll negotiate a price with him.
Is that in your recommendation too?
It is. And we do that for architects and engineers on the theory that if you're building critical infrastructure, you don't want to go to the low-price bidder to design it.
Oh, okay.
You should have the same thing, and you should have that same authority for software.
Yeah, one more question before I turn to Senator Kelly. This issue of the Valley of Death, and again, I think this is a giant strategic opportunity for us now that we have all these tech companies and innovators who really want to help on our national defense. I know it's a complicated issue. I hear it from so many, and I'm sure all of you do too. What would you, in all of your vast experiences, A, do you agree with me it's a big problem? And it's also an opportunity that we have, again, this part of our economy that wants to help the Pentagon. And then what would you give to us as kind of the, top 3 pithy recommendations, and are they regs or is it authorities that we need to provide? And I'll just open that up to all 3 of you.
Senator, let me just take that one too, just at least to start, because this is something the PPBE Commission spent a lot of time thinking about. This deals with how we fund things. And there are 2 different ways that the PPBE Commission went at this. One is the question of the way the budget is structured. So we structure our budget into such small boxes that it's hard to move money around, so it's hard to make it available if we have an opportunity that shows up in the year of execution. So the technology is suddenly proven, and we don't have any money in the right box, so we can't make it available.
And the company goes out of business.
And the company may go out of business. Exactly. So we have budget structure recommendations to talk about structuring the budget differently so that money is more flexible. We have reprogramming recommendations, which talk about making it easier to move money if you need to at the last minute. And we have smaller recommendations like the software recommendation I just mentioned to you about relieving some of the pressure on software that would make money more flexible. And all these things that gave you, and we have recommendations about delegating further down within the Department of Defense, so things the department can do itself, delegating further down within the Department of Defense, writing budget justifications more clearly. All these things can provide more flexibility in the year of execution, which can make it easier to move money, which can make it easier to solve problems like that. The one thing I would add to that is I don't want to make it like this is a complete panacea, because a part of the problem will always be, is there enough money? So, and where do we find the money? So it would be nice if we could commit to all these companies, if your technology proves out, we'll fund it. But we don't have enough money to make that commitment to all those companies. And sometimes it proves out, and we have to look at it and say, well, it would be nice to have, but I don't have money for it.
Yeah.
And so the problem won't go away even if you make the process easier, but we ought to take out some of these hurdles that we've got in the system.
Okay. Any other quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the Department of Defense needs to start looking as it is a venture capital firm. And there's a valley of death in the VC world from round A to round B to round C to round D, and we could be looking at the same thing for initial prototype, advanced prototype, operational prototype, and so on. And there should be bridge funds between every one of those just like a VC would, and if something hits, we're going to spend it on this, and it's flexible enough to do that. I would bring together like the VCs do, which essentially is they compete. The companies are competing for their money all the time, and I would bring the entire industrial base, if it's possible, into an OTA consortium, a non-traditional OTA consortium, to do that, where you could essentially drive round A's, round B's, round C's, round D's, different types of competitions within that industrial base for the type of programs necessary. Because if they hit, then you can go to the next bridge fund and say, okay, this is C round, we're going to go for it. If you don't have enough money in your D round funds, well, then everyone's just kind of going to go away. But if you've got that money that's flexible enough to put on the table, if someone succeeds, then you've got something. And I have to say the most successful OTA we've had was with SpaceX in the sense that we promised that they would essentially, if you can build it, we'll pay for it. MRAPs were the same way. If you build it, we will have money to put on it. That offer of some kind of potential payoff is what will leap over the valley of death. But if you don't have it, you're always going to have a valley of death.
I will say that I can remember sitting in DMAGS, this is the senior DOD budget decision forum, and having the group make a decision, we're going to fund these dozen different experiments in an area, and having the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition stand up and say, I'm all for funding these, it's the right thing to do, but you all should know, if they're successful, we don't have money to field any of them.
So, 3 things. Let me perhaps suggest guiding lights, but before I do, to reiterate one thing Peter said, this is very hard, this is very complicated. I would suggest no 3 ideas will absolutely solve the problem. Right? It's a lot of ideas and a lot of effort in a lot of ways over time. It's very complicated, but some guiding lights, if I may offer. The first one is, you mentioned, Senator, all these VCs and other companies that want to help. They also need to run a business. And sometimes DOD doesn't recognize cash flow and profits matter to these companies. And if they can't make money, if they jeopardize their commercial markets, they are not going to stay in this business and we will lose them. There's a reason why the defense industrial base has decreased in size for the last 12 years. Second guiding light, time matters for these companies. They don't have the luxury that DOD does of saying, well, we're going to delay delivery because this part isn't qualifying when it's not a safety issue. Right? That is a problem. Time for delivery, time to contract. In this warp speed, which was another successful OTA, in fact, General Perna said warp speed wouldn't have gone at warp speed without an OTA in that particular case, was his exact quote. Time matters to companies, and DOD doesn't always appreciate that. And the third thing I would say is relationships matter to industry. You know, sometimes, industry has a setback, sometimes DOD gets a setback. But it's not about always what's the letter of the contract or the law, but how you work together. And I would suggest they could probably use a relationship therapist sometimes.
Senator Kelly?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to just follow up a little bit on this. 30 years ago, when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, I had one elective, and I took an acquisition elective, and I was shocked at how complicated this whole process was. I mean, it seemed to be more complicated than most any other class I had. And I was there as a aeronautical engineering student. And I would say over 30 years, I think we've made some progress here. I mean, SpaceX is one example. I'm not sure we have another. Maybe you could share, Dr. Greenwald, if we do have other examples. Yes. But if we could, and I am perfectly willing to take the blame here for Congress, has this been a failure of Congress not to be able to innovate fast enough in acquisition, or is it just entrenched interests at DOD and maybe some of the big defense contractors? Like where do we, what has been the big stumbling block to actually making significant progress in reforming the system?
So, Senator, before you take blame for Congress for 30 years ago, I should confess that Bill and I met 30 years ago when we were on congressional staff together working on this problem. Yep. So we're to blame. We worked together. The first thing we worked together on was the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act in 1994.
Did it pass?
Which passed, and which was the first major congressional effort to streamline commercial purchasing. So this is an issue that Congress has been battering its head against for decades now. I think we're making progress on it. I think we're better at it than we used to be, but it's hard. And I just need to come back around to, there are things we do to make it harder, and Bill and I both discussed some of these and have some recommendations in our prepared statements about reducing unnecessary requirements and peeling back some of the buildup. So in 1992, we said produce a streamlined contract for commercial contracts where you eliminate clauses that aren't necessary and shouldn't apply to commercial companies. And we got down to a certain number, and then over 30 years it's built up again, and it's time to relook at it. But don't underestimate how hard it is for the department to buy commercial technologies, because it's all great that these technologies are out there in the commercial marketplace and that are available to us, but the experience over a period of decades is it costs more and takes longer to take a commercial marketplace and apply it to defense uses than it does to build it in the first place. It's really hard work.
I was at the ribbon cutting last week at the Southwest Mission Accelerator that we procured money to build 5 of these around the country. I think there's one in Hawaii, Oregon, Kansas, some other location somewhere, and it's to try to help some of these entrepreneurial companies get across that, maybe not get across the valley of death, but even the stuff that's more upfront and connecting them with, financing and expertise. Do you see something like Southwest MAC or these other accelerators to be helpful in this process?
I think what's important is to, in as many ways as possible, bring together that non-traditional industrial base so the government can essentially work with it. And the other example I would give as far as success is Operation Warp Speed. And why was that successful? Because we brought together the non-traditional medical industrial base in one acquisition vehicle, and it was ready when an emergency hit. We should be doing that with every single...
Was that done before the pandemic?
It was done before. If it wasn't done before the pandemic, we'd probably be still trying to figure out what kind of acquisition vehicle to use to develop a vaccine. Okay. I mean, that's essentially...
So that was all stood up and ready to go?
It was stood up and ready to go, and it was almost by accident. Mm-hmm. But it was the right vehicle to be able to put a lot of money through and research and do it fast. And that's the thing we need. We have a traditional system, and we can go slow in a lot of different areas, but we should have emergency vehicles ready to go if things happen that we need to go with. And I think that one was one of those success stories. Peter talking about success story on commercial item acquisition. We have it's a lot of different system than it was pre-1994. That's a positive thing. We backtracked a lot, but we still are buying, to a great degree, a lot of commercial items, and that's a good thing.
If I may, Senator, there's a lot that is improved, substantially, right? So a lot of us are talking here about what's not going as well as we would like, but there's a lot that's going very well. Defense Acquisition University was established. Even all these regulations, as Peter mentioned, there wasn't even centralized regulations. We have a more professionalized workforce. If you even want to look at the data, the cost growth is not higher than it used to be historically really far back, even though the systems are that much more complicated with that many more technologies. You could go to the Civil War, and this is true. Congress put out 2 1,100-page reports, and the things that they talk about that happened would never happen in our current acquisition system. A lot has been done. I think what we are talking about is how we can do more and do better because of the geopolitical issues that we have.
You're talking about bad things that happened during the Civil War in acquisition?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, can you give us an example?
Yeah, lame horses. Horses that actually you could not ride. Food that was in fact spoiled. Cannons that in fact would not fire, I guess would be the term. There was even one, well, I won't go into that one, but things that actually would be shocking to see today.
Right.
But now we were able to do logistics overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan at a level that they could not even do 30 miles away. So there has been a lot of progress, and I do think that is important to highlight.
All right. Well,
Senator, if I could just put in a pitch for one other thing. As we try to deal with non-traditional contractors, and they face this stack of regulations, the federal regulations, and they also face the problem of not knowing even who to talk to in the Department of Defense. It's a vast and imposing organization. One of the things that I've learned on a project that I'm working on right now is that really helpful to non-traditional contractors when they want to do business with the government is to have sort of a Sherpa to take them through it, somebody who knows the process. Well, who knows the process? People who've left government and understand how the process can work. And we have regulations on post-government employment that make it harder and harder for them to do that. And there are reasons why we have limitations on what people can do after they leave government. But I would urge that you need to think about what the impact is on the non-traditional contractors, especially because they need those people to guide them through this morass and tell them, here's who you need to go to talk to. Here's the kind of paper you need to do. Here's what you're getting yourself into if you do this, and who can be honest guides to that.
All right, thank you.
Mia, I just had one final question, and this again can be for everybody, but Mr. Schwartz, can you discuss some of your findings on the other transactions consortia and whether they lower the barrier to entry for non-traditional defense contractors?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the credit for those authorities are for the other people here. But I'll give you a couple of examples. So the other transaction authority, we already went through the data of how the number of companies in consortia have increased dramatically, where at the same time the defense industrial base has decreased. The way Operation Warp Speed worked is that a consortia was put together. Consortia, in short, is a number of companies all with a similar interest around a particular technology, in this case health, because it can be a broad thing. And there were a lot of companies, and they had been working together already, and they already have existing base contracts with the Department of Defense in this particular case. So they already know each other, they already have the mechanisms, they already have the processes and the relationships down. So what happened here is, with Operation Warp Speed, DOD said, this is what we need. And I might get the numbers a little bit wrong, it is in this report that I have on consortia right in front of me. In something like 72 hours, I think it was, they got out requests to something like 1,100 companies, right? In days, they got responses because it was already set up. And that helps with the market research, and it helps with the processes, so you don't have to start going through this because it was already put in place. That's the power of what consortia can do. It increases communication between the government and industry. It increases the ability to work more efficiently because most consortia work with other transaction authorities, and other transaction authority, for the most part, are exempt from most of the regulations in the federal acquisition regulation. Now, it's not for everybody, and it's not for all circumstances. It is definitely not a silver bullet, but it does do that, and there are small companies that have said, and I can absolutely provide this information after the hearing, that but for the consortia they worked with, they never would have contracted with the Department of Defense. Does that help?
Yeah, very helpful. Good. Well, thank you, Madam Chair.
Can you just tell me a little bit more about what you mean by consortia that are already set up to push the kind of
I'll start with the other transactions, because another transaction is essentially not a contract. It's a contract, but it's legally defined as not a contract. And because of that, it's very confusing. Because of that, it doesn't have to apply to things that apply to a contract. So it's a new business relationship that the government can enter with the private sector and essentially negotiate any type of relationship they want. So a consortium, essentially, what that does is brings together in a vehicle a way of bringing as many contractors as possible onto that consortium into a certain area. And then what you can do with that consortium is task it to do certain things, very simply, not through this process, but through a process that may be like this.
So you're saying that the DOD can create these kind of consortiums as it did in Operation Warp Speed, and depending on what it is that's defined as the need, they can already do that. Is that what you're saying?
They have the authority, and they have done about 40 of them now?
Yeah, they in fact do it. And
yes. But what's necessary is a lot of these are in traditional defense sectors. And there are a lot of non-traditional defense sectors like AI or quantum or autonomy, where it would be a good idea to set these up and pull together new small businesses, new non-traditional companies, so the department can start working with them. And they can work with them on a set of a framework that's not based on this, but based on something that's more commercially available and understandable to these companies.
Right, and it does two things. I mean, it does many things, but two that I would like to highlight. One is it sends a message. This is what DOD is interested in, or any other agency, and those companies start gathering around that technology, like Undersea. Undersea is an example of another one, and they get together. And what's great is it's not small businesses, it's not non-traditionals, it's not large contractors, it's all of them in that milieu of innovation, which is very valuable. The second thing it really creates a catalyst for better back and forth communication with DOD of what do you really need. Sometimes DOD will put out an RFP and they'll be surprised, and there's an example actually in the report I mentioned that nobody responded. And then in this consortia mechanism, there's a way for better communication where industry is freer to communicate back, and they're like, oh, okay, we got it, we can craft something together, and then they get to better results.
Senator, at the basis of it, a contract you can only enter with one company. That's why we have prime contractors, and everybody else is going to be a subcontractor. Because the usual contract rules don't apply to OTAs, we can enter an OTA with a group or a collection. And by the way, I would add to that, it's not just companies, it's also research institutions.
Right.
So
academic
institutions are included in these too. And then they can informally get together and talk about what the best use of money is, and consult with the government as to where funding should go to address the purpose. It gives you some of the flexibility that we talk about that our budgeting system denies in so many ways, because once the money is allocated to a consortium, there's a lot of flexibility to where you move it around to best purpose.
So you were on the commission. You were on the commission, right? That we heard from this morning in the full hearing.
Yes.
So I don't know that there was any discussion about we should create these kinds of entities called consortiums to address some of the needs of DOD. Was there some discussion about this kind of way of doing things?
The commission did not go into consortia, and largely because there have been lots of commissions on acquisition reform, and we were focused on the budget side of the way the department works. Well, we had some recommendations that go to the same kind of thing, talking about the level to which we budget and the different boxes that we put our budget into are being so small and inflexible, and getting bigger boxes and different boxes and better defined boxes to give greater flexibility.
Yes, but listening to you, it sounds as though creating these kinds of consortiums would be another way that we can get to the kind of acquisitions that would be faster.
It's helpful, yes. but we should realize
it's not the answer to all of our
consortiums
problems.
are usually used, and I say to the 99th%, you can disagree with me, for research, and usually advanced research, and that's where the consortiums have focused.
Yes, because I was wondering when we were going to talk about AI and all of those aspects of what the DOD and everybody else is concerned about these days. So. Well, I noticed that I'm the only one left, so I want to thank you all for a very stimulating testimony, and we will be doing some follow-up from my office with those of you that we need to continue to talk to. But I find the consortium idea very intriguing, and I'd like to, think a little bit more about that. But I do have one question about that stack of papers that you all have. Now, at some point, the acquisition people who have to comply with all of those requirements, after a while, don't they have enough experience that they don't have to resort to all of that, and they know that they can skim over or be smart about what they need to be doing, so that they're not hidebound by all of those requirements, and
yes.
Through experience they can take smart risks?
Yes, Senator. For any given type of procurement and any given type of issue, you're going to be looking for what's on page so-and-so of this. And you're not going to, nobody reads through this whole thing. Yes. I doubt anybody has ever read through this whole thing unless most.
I haven't actually.
Okay. The only person I ever thought might. What you do is you look for the answer to the specific question you have. And about 15 or 20 years ago, this was supposedly all rewritten, and since I haven't read it, I can't guarantee that it was, to separate between what's called direction and guidance, so that only those words that needed to be directive were directive, and the rest of it was going to be in the form of advice and consideration, so that it would build more flexibility into it. I can't tell you how successful it was in it being rewritten that way, but I've made the point before, if you're going to rewrite it that way so it's more flexible, it probably makes it longer, because when you give somebody guidance and talk about here are all your different alternatives, you've got to lay out choices and explain considerations. That's a lot harder than just to say, here's the rule, you can only use a fixed price contract.
But I will say two things. One is, even though, and you're absolutely right, people only necessarily need 150, they're doing commercial buying or something like that, at some point, the brain shuts down, right? So, and this is true, if I'm told go buy cereal and I go to the supermarket and see how many cereals they have, I just need someone to tell me which cereal to buy, because I can't compute that many choices. There are too many choices. And I've dealt with contracting officers who just revert back to the 3 or 4 authorities they know, because even though there are 17 or 18 authorities, they can't compute that many, so it doesn't matter you gave them more authority, they're just going to keep doing the same thing. So I would argue sometimes less authority is in fact more authority.
Well,
I'm
based on this morning's hearing also, you know, the idea of having people who take smart risks, it's not to minimize all risks, but it's to take the smart risks that's necessary to get us the decisions that we need. Thank you very much for your time and testimony. This hearing is adjourned.